Okay. Looks like it's 1 p.m. So welcome everyone to Drisha Spring Program. And this is the final class in this 4-class series on suffering, prosperity, and prosperity, a Jewish philosophical exploration. We value everyone's active participation, so we do encourage you to turn on your camera if you're able to. And feel free to ask questions by either unmuting yourself or writing them as comments in the chat box here on Zoom or as a comment on Facebook. And with that, I'll turn this to Dr. Segal.
Okay, thank you so much. I don't know if we're a little down in attendance because everyone is anti-skeptical and the session was advertised as a skeptical or skeptical theistic session, or because on the opposite ends of things, maybe people were sort of itching for this kind of response to begin with. I think it's a very natural response. It would have been a natural response at any point. It's, I think in the modern period, become even more sort of the immediate go-to reply. And if we needed any reminder of this, then the events of this past week, I think have driven the point home. It's very tempting to say, well, we're beyond our depth in discussing this question. And so what I want to explore today is that very response, the we're beyond our depth response, and look at what it might mean, how we might deploy it, and what sources there might be, and we'll try to subject it to some critical analysis and see if it can withstand philosophical scrutiny. Maybe at the end of the day, it'll raise more problems that it attempts to solve or skirt. So we ended up the last session by saying with an approach that was extremely speculative, this multiverse idea, and we said it's so speculative that it might suggest that there's much that we don't know about the universe, much that we don't know about reality, if it includes more universes, and so maybe best not to speculate. And that very attitude is one that I think if you go back to the chapter in Job that we looked at last time at the beginning, you might see pretty clearly if you're on the lookout for it. Right? So we looked at that chapter. I sort of cherry-picked some verses that I thought supported at least one kind of smallness, right? An axiological smallness, and maybe also a metaphysical smallness. But we didn't focus on a third kind of smallness, and that's an intellectual or epistemic insignificance limitation that comes to the fore when you start, well, even if you don't look for it, but it's definitely there in that chapter. Okay, so if you maybe cherry pick different verses, you get a continued emphasis. Sorry, I'm going to share the handout right now. Okay, so here I've just highlighted, in some cases, the very same verses, but we'll maybe focus on a different aspect of those verses, and in some cases, different verses that I've put in bold. But all of the ones that I've bolded here make some mention of the fact that we're limited in our knowledge of things, in our understanding of things, in our ability to penetrate reality. Okay, so starting already from verse 2, who is it? Who is this that darken counsel by words without knowledge? We're putting Job in his place regarding what he knows or is ignorant of. Then in verse 4, where was thou when I laid the foundations of the earth? Declare if thou hast the understanding. There's that word again, yeda and bina. Misam mimadeha ki teda o minata leakav. Who determined the measures thereof if you know? And obviously the answer is you don't know, Job. Okay, and if we go down further in the chapter, starting in verse 18, okay, have you surveyed the whole breadths declare if you know it all. We brought this verse last time. There it was to emphasize the breadth of the cosmos, of the universe, as opposed to Job, who is so small in comparison. But if you if you're focused on a different component, there is again this mention of what Job does or does not know. Okay, and the same goes for the rest of the verses here, the ones that I've highlighted. You could look at these and see that this theme persists throughout. Right, so I think quite plausibly the point in this chapter, at least in these highlighted verses, is that there is this vast epistemic gap. Epistemic meaning having to do with knowledge, what the various parties know, right, that God knows so much more, and maybe in a different way even from the way that Job knows. Okay, and the question is, again, if we're going to take this speech as in some way addressing the problem, that's not to say necessarily it's offering a solution. That's one of the things we're going to look at today, is ways of addressing that don't involve a solution. But if at the very least the chapter is trying to address the issue, the intellectual question, the theoretical question that we've been grappling with, then it seems that at least one of the points that's trying to be made, if not the main point in this speech, is that there is this vast gap between what Job knows so very little in terms of the what has occurred from the beginning until the end. His vantage point is so narrow, temporally speaking, it's so narrow, spatially speaking, and he just doesn't have the understanding of the workings, what makes the various things tick. Okay, that's the point that God seems to be making here. Now, how does that address the issue at all? Right? In what way might this address the issue? How can we turn this, if it's meant to be a response, into something that we can work with philosophically? So one way to do so is the way that Maimonides does, the Rambam does in the guide 3. Sorry, that should be 23, not 33. That's my mistake. In 3:23. And we've already seen a number of ways in which Rambam addresses the problem of evil. So clearly there's a lot going on in the guide, and this may not be his final answer. But he does say, when it comes to the book of Job, what he's going to tell us, and we're going to see in a second, that this is essentially the entire point of the book, what he's about to tell us, and how it's supposed to help us in some way cope with the problem of evil and with the actual evils that befall us. So what does he say here? He points to, among other things, a massive gap, okay, between what we understand and what we know, and what God understands and what he knows. Okay, so I'll start reading just in the English here. The description of all these things serves to impress on our minds that we are unable to comprehend how these transient creatures come into existence, right? So basically in this speech, God is just talking about all these other, beasts and fowl and all sorts of things that really have nothing to do with man at all. And God points out that Job, at least, has very little idea about how these things come into existence, how their natural properties commence to exist, Rambam says, and that these are not like the things which we are able to produce. So they are beyond our capabilities to replicate, or at least they were in Job's time. And then Maimonides continued, much less can we compare the manner in which God rules and manages his creatures with the manner in which we rule and manage certain beings. Okay, so now he's expanding the distinction beyond a mere epistemic one to include several of the important concepts that are at play in generating the problem of evil. Right? We have at play, when we first formulated the problem, God's knowledge, that God knows that there's this evil that's going to take place, that he can prevent. We had in formulating the problem, some idea of God's power. God has the power to prevent this, and something about God's will, right? That he has a providential concern for humanity, the world, whatever the case may be, that's supposed to follow from certain facts about God and what God's like. And that was all part of the setup of the problem. And now Maimonides, Rambam is calling on us to sort of draw a very sharp distinction between those concepts as they figure in the problem of evil, as we formulated them, and the ordinary concepts that we have. Okay, and this leads up to what he emphasizes at various other points in the guide. It's one of the main upshots of chapters 50 through 70 in part 1 of the guide. But here it now takes center stage in addressing the problem of evil, and that is his negative theology, his apophaticism, his idea that there is nothing in common between creatures and God. Any term that we might use applied to God, even if we sometimes use the very same term to apply to people, like, he knows that. So you might say of God, that God knows such and such. We might say a person has certain powers, certain abilities, and we could sometimes speak that way of God. But his doctrine of pure equivocation, that's really the relevant point, not exactly the negative theology piece, although people may be more familiar with negative theology, but his doctrine that these terms are purely equivocal, that there is literally nothing in common between the concept that's picked out by the term when applied to creatures and the concept that's picked out by that term when we apply it to God. Maimonides says that's the upshot, that's the point of this book. That's what we're supposed to come to understand. And so when you apply that to the various components, the pieces that made up the original problem, it sort of deflates the puzzle, it deflates the problem of evil from the get-go. Right? He goes on to say quite clearly the term rule, I am right here, I don't know if you can see, sorry, one second. You see that cursor? Yeah, okay. The term rule has not the same definition in both cases. It signifies, now I see the annotate. It signifies two different notions which have nothing in common but the name. In the same manner as there's a difference between works of nature and productions of human handicraft, so there's a difference between God's rule, providence, and intention in reference to all natural forces, and on the one hand, and our rule, providence, and intention in reference to things which are the objects of our rule, providence, and intention. And then this is where he makes this very stark claim. This lesson is the principal object of the whole book of Job. It lays down this principle of faith and recommends us to derive a proof from nature that we should not fall into the error of imagining his knowledge to be similar to ours, or his intention, providence, and rule similar to ours. Okay, so he is employing this general view that he's argued for in a bunch of places, and he's employing that view that these are purely equivocal. There's nothing in common between them to address the problem of evil. Right? And if we understand not just that there's a vast quantitative gap, that God knows so much more, but that God's knowledge just isn't anything like our knowledge. Okay, on the face of it, that seems to me that we can't really understand what God's knowledge is at all. Right, we have no understanding of it. Same thing for his power and so on. Well, if that's the case, then you can't really get the problem off the ground. Right? All of those things have to have a consistent meaning throughout the argument in order for the argument, the original argument, to go through. Right? So it might follow from God's being who he is, that he has unlimited knowledge and unlimited power and unlimited desire or will to benefit his creatures. But if all of those things mean one thing in that claim, and then when we get to the claim that says, well, if it were the case that there were a being that had unlimited knowledge, unlimited power, and so on, then there wouldn't be evil, or there wouldn't be evil in this to this degree. We have to have a consistent meaning there. But that second claim, we really only have a grip on it if we're working with the ordinary notion of knowledge that we have, the ordinary notion of power that we have. Right? If we're talking about something else, something that applies only in case of God and that we really have no understanding of, then we can't infer anything really from the fact that God has unlimited power and unlimited knowledge about whether we should see the kind of evil that we do. Okay. So now this isn't so much an epistemic solution. Okay, I'm starting with this really, in a sense, only to set it aside. It doesn't fall under the categories that I mentioned in the title or in the description. This is making use of a distinction, according to Rambam, a qualitative distinction between, say, God's knowledge on the one hand, our knowledge on the other hand, but also God's power on the one hand, our power on the other hand, to completely pull out the rug from underneath the argument. Okay, now, this is, an approach that's certainly worthy of consideration if you're already on board with Maimonides in his negative theology and in his doctrine of pure equivocation in general. Okay, but that view already has serious costs. It's no surprise that you can't really raise the problem of evil if you can't really raise any theological questions or make any theological claims in the first place. And that's effectively what the Rambam's view has led to. Okay, I mean, if you really endorse that view, then just like he says here, you're not going to be able to figure out that it follows from these things about God that there won't be this evil. Well, it'll also be the case that you won't be able to figure out anything about what follows from God's being X or Y about anything else. Okay, and this was a criticism leveled at Maimonides by Gersonides and by others. And it's really a very serious challenge, right? I mean, if we have no understanding whatsoever of what these terms come to, because they're so radically different, then we also can't figure out what they imply or what implies them. Okay, and so the whole project of any sort of theology seems to be a complete non-starter. Okay, but in addition to that, in addition to the general theological cost, I think we should remind ourselves of the point we made in the first lecture, which is that there are really a number of problems of evil. And I'm not sure that this, even if it deflates some of them, it just takes the air out of some of the classical problems of evil, if it really successfully deflates all of the problems of evil. In particular, I'm thinking of the third one that we mentioned, the one that I think is highlighted most in the biblical text, in the rabbinic text, of tzaddik v'ralo, rasha v'tovlo, which we suggested is a different kind of problem from the one that Hume puts forward in the name of Epicurus and the one that Leibniz calls attention to. And it's the problem of the moral incoherence of the world. The world just seems to be morally incoherent, right? And it's not clear how taking a view about God's nature or about how our language about God operates is going to do anything to diffuse that problem, to address that problem, to make that problem any less overwhelming than it originally is. The world still seems to be completely morally incoherent. So maybe it's not especially bad for us as theists, because if you hold like the Rambam, then the distinction between a theist and someone who isn't a theist becomes much more subtle, and maybe a little more difficult to grasp. So maybe it's not a particular problem, especially for us as theists. but it's a problem nonetheless, right? I mean, it just seems to be to create a real sense of meaninglessness about the universe and about our lives. So again, I mean, I think we noted this also in the first lecture, that this is important in looking at one of the other solutions preferred by the Rambam, in the Neoplatonic solution, that evil isn't fully real. Those things that are evil, if they were fully real, well, that would be, they'd be fully evil, but they're not fully existent, they're just privations. And what we noted is that even if that succeeds, even if it's true, it only addresses sort of the classical formulation, classical philosophical formulation of the problem, not the classical Jewish formulation of the problem. I think you encounter a similar thing regarding this piece in Maimonides as well. Okay, so I want to look at instead, and I'm happy to take any questions if there are questions about that. Otherwise, we'll go to Nachmanides, who takes, yes, Doug, is that?
Okay. This whole thing ends up being a statement that we don't know what evil, our idea of evil has nothing to do with God's idea of evil is, that we can't possibly know. We're not competent to even judge what is evil or isn't evil.
So that's going to be sort of the next approach, which says that we're limited in our competence in addressing or knowing what's evil and what's not evil, or what goods there are and what evils there are out there. This, in a way, is maybe even more radical, right? It's not just that we're limited in our competence to judge that, it's that, like you started to say, these just mean completely different things when it comes to God and when it comes to us. The same, the same thing that we could say about knowledge and power, presumably we'll have to say about good. Okay, and then when we apply the word good to God or just to God, it's going to mean something completely different. And then sort of that just takes all of the air out of what we ordinarily think of as this classical picture of God, what makes him worthy of worship.
We know from Genesis that God considered this very good. So
right.
What business do we have of questioning the situation?
Yeah. I mean, that's a fair question, and then maybe that's a good way to put what I think we're going to see in Nachmanides. It's not just the fact that God declared it good, but God declared it good, and to some extent we see that there's all this goodness around. And then we might say to ourselves, okay, so who are we, or how dare we then question regarding the things that we don't understand or that are beyond our comprehension? So that is the next approach that I want to look at. This is the approach that in the contemporary philosophical parlance goes by the name skeptical theism. I think you see it more or less in these words of Nachmanides. Okay, Nachmanides in his treatise, it's a treatise on mourning, really, and at the end he takes up the question of divine providence, reward and punishment, and how we're supposed to understand evil. And after a very long discussion of theodicy, and he has his own theodicy, which involves reincarnation, but that's not really the point right now. He says something very interesting. He says, so he says, it seems that most of the things that God says to Job are to exalt God's wonderful actions, to inform him of everything that God's done, that mi'ut da'ato shel Iyov b'yesod hanivraim, and the sort of the poverty of Job's own knowledge regarding the nature of creation, the elements of creation. He didn't know really the very basics, first thing about heaven and earth, beast and fowl, the sea and everything in it, right? And the whole manner of creation. Someone doesn't know even the first thing about these things that are sort of terrestrial and in some sense, nearby. And he sees that still everything is taken care of in a way. These things have no merit, they have no responsibility whatsoever, so they don't deserve these things, and still they get them, this treatment. Why wouldn't it be? And here it's sort of a question about what's rational for a person to think. Wouldn't it be rational for a person to think that the ways of God regarding humankind are hidden? Okay, and I'll skip the next line for a second. Once he sees that God has such mercy on all of these other lower creatures, why will he think or question after the king, that is God, has handed down whatever decisions he has handed down regarding what he has already done? That is, at that point, given this vast gap, a person should actually say to himself, boy, right, there's probably so much that I don't understand, so much that I don't know, that, there's an answer to this problem. There are things that could very well explain what's going on when there's suffering and evil, but it's very likely hidden from me. It's very likely that there are such things that are hidden. Okay, and so, like I said, this approach goes by the name skeptical theism, not because it's skeptical about theism. It's a combination of theism, okay, belief in God, with a certain skepticism. A skepticism about our ability to see what kinds of goods there are out there, and what possible goods there are out there, what kind of evils or bad things there could be or could have been, and what are the connections, the logical connections between these things. I mean, we're very limited at the end of the day in our cognitive capacities. When you think about our insignificance vis-a-vis the cosmos, we've managed to achieve a lot. But to think that we, if we think long and hard and can't think of some solution, some defense, or some theodicy, right? We can't think of any good that would justify this particular evil or evil in general. To think that therefore we could reasonably conclude that there probably isn't any evil, any such good, right? That seems to be, misplaced, misguided. It's not a well-founded sort of inference. Okay, to infer that, it was to infer that we have a lot more knowledge than we in fact have. Because here's a characteristic statement. Took this from what is essentially an encyclopedia entry on skeptical theism. According to skeptical theism, if there were a God, it is likely that he would have reasons for acting that are beyond our ken, and thus we are not justified in making all things considered judgments about what the world would be like if there were a God. So the whole point of skeptical theism is as a defensive maneuver against the arguments that we started with. And it's a maneuver that says that you who's offering this argument, you have to assume something very, very strong about our abilities to penetrate the truths about reality and what possible goods and evils there are. But you have to assume that if we've thought long and hard and we haven't come up with one, that there very likely isn't one. Or you have to think that the goods that we can think of are sort of representative of all the goods that there possibly are, in order for the argument, the original argument, to really have any force. Okay, because the original argument was saying, if there were a God like this, the world wouldn't be like this. Okay, and skeptical theism says, no, that's a bad inference. You can't infer from the fact that you don't see a good reason that there isn't a good reason. Sometimes that's a good inference. If you walk into a well-lit room and you don't, I'm in a small room right here and I don't see any lion, I can infer there's no lion here. I mean, maybe I'm wrong, Maybe it's a tiny little lion, but it's a pretty good inference. It's very likely that there's no lion right here in this very little room. I look around, I don't see it. But that's only because I think that my evidence is pretty representative. Right? I think that my cognitive capacities are well suited to uncover pretty much the whole truth about the presence of lions in an area like this. But when it comes to the whole of reality and what possible goods and evils there are, I mean, it doesn't seem like we have any good reason to think that we have such cognitive access. Okay, so he goes on to say something that's even weirder than what he said before, but which is sufficient. In particular, the fact that we don't see a good reason for X does not justify the conclusion that there is no good reason for X. Okay, so now this is an epistemic solution. It's not an epistemic theodicy, right? I mean, we're not proposing a theodicy in the manner of the ones that we looked at in the previous two classes. And we're also not sort of undercutting the entire problem the way the Rambam did, but we're suggesting that we're exempt from finding a solution, and for very good reason, right? I mean, intellectually, rationally, everyone, according to this, even an atheist, should concede that we are ill-equipped to judge what possible goods could justify the evil that we see. Okay, and so we don't have to suggest any particular solution, any particular defense, any reason that God might have done or allowed what he allowed. We can just point to this very general fact about the impoverishment of our cognitive capacities. Okay, now this is a very, I think, interesting solution. It is, I think, strange that it's taken so long for contemporary philosophers to sort of start treating it seriously and discussing it. I mean, I think it's sort of like the natural response for a believer, and it's one that I think is well grounded in our very ancient sources. But in any case, contemporary philosophers finally have started turning their attention to it, and they developed this response. And in turn, it also elicited some very important and interesting criticisms. Okay, and the criticisms, there are a number of them, but the main one, I'd say, is of the form that once you endorse this kind of skepticism, it's very hard to contain it. It's very hard to say, okay, yeah, we'll be skeptical in this way. We can note how ignorant we are with regard to this kind of question without it just exploding and leading to a much, much broader skepticism. Okay, it could be a skepticism about a lot of things, but I'm going to focus on one kind of skepticism, maybe because that's the one that sort of speaks to us most directly in a practical way, and that's moral skepticism. Okay, skepticism about good and bad, that is our knowledge of good and bad. Okay, and this touches on what you raised just a few minutes ago, that this approach maybe suggests that we have a very infirm grasp on what's good and what's evil. Okay, and where does that leave us when it comes to ethics then, right? To figuring out what we should do and how we should live. So let's be clear, though, on exactly what the problem is and how this generates a sort of skepticism. So to be clear, that the criticism isn't that because, if you're endorsing this kind of view, then you can't know regarding anything at all, whether it's good or bad. Right? I mean, this view just says that we're limited in our capacity to know what goods there are, what possible goods and possible evils there are. Right? I mean, you can hold that. You can think that there are vast regions of sort of in this abstract space of goods and evils that we're just unfamiliar with, while still thinking that there are some cases that we confront of things that are good, maybe very good, and things that are evil, maybe very evil, that we can just identify as such. I mean, that's perfectly consistent with it being the case that we're still extremely limited in our ability to conceive of or imagine, what kind of goods there could possibly be. There doesn't seem to be any tension there at all. Okay, so there's no sort of direct route from a skepticism of this sort to saying, oh, we don't have any idea now what's good or bad. We can't tell, if a parent loving a child and a child loving a parent in return is good or totally evil. I mean, we could see that's just a very good thing. Maybe one of the finest things there are. So that's not threatened. Okay. Likewise, and you might think the problem is, look, once we acknowledge that God has all of these hidden reasons, or he could well have these hidden reasons, and we acknowledge that by way of saying, we can't really figure out what the consequences of what we do are, right? I mean, there's just so much out there. What we do, what happens in this world, all of those things, they have consequences. They're intricately tied up with other aspects of what's going on elsewhere or at other times, right? And so if that's the case, wait a minute, now we're sort of paralyzed morally, because if we want to figure out what's the right thing to do, one natural response is we'll do whatever will bring about the most good. Okay, that's a consequentialist answer to the question of what should we do. But now, if we can't really figure that out, and we can't make heads or tails, we can't know what the connections are between this terrible thing and everything else that's going on. But likewise, between what we eat for breakfast, or where we give tzedakah to, or which lectures we show up to, on the one hand, and all the other things that are going on in the universe. I mean, maybe there are these hidden connections that we're unaware of. That seems like it could paralyze us. How are we supposed to figure out then what to do? Now, I don't think that is really where the problem is at, only because, well, maybe for a few reasons, but one of them is, even if you do think that that's the right answer to the question of what should I do, the answer is, well, do whatever will bring about the best consequences. It seems like really what we should say is, you should do whatever seems, according to the best available evidence that you have, will bring about the best consequences. So of course, there are lots of unintended consequences and lots of things that we can't predict. And we muddle through things and do our best. And that's the best that we can do, right? And maybe that is thereby the right thing to do. It's the right thing to do because, as it seems to us, that's going to lead to the most good. Okay, but where the problem really lies, and I'll take a question in a second, where the problem really lies is that for a theist who endorses this answer, this skeptical theist view, we're now basically saying God is permitting, right, all of this evil for reasons that are wholly unknown to us. We don't understand, why God is permitting this evil, but he has his reasons. Well, if that's the case, I mean, who are we to now interfere with God's plan? Maybe his reasons are such that we shouldn't be getting involved. We shouldn't be stopping all of that evil. We shouldn't be alleviating that suffering. Okay, and that's a very unpalatable consequence. Okay, to be clear, I'm not endorsing that consequence. The point is, this is a criticism. That is sort of a reductio ad absurdum of the view. It's now, it seems, leading to the conclusion that we should step back, or we have no good reason, at least, to intervene and to prevent the evils that we see. Okay, that is the challenge, let's say, that we're going to consider for the next few minutes to skeptical theism. Yes, I bet there's a question.
But there's a corollary to what I said before, that God sees everything as good, is that God sees humanity as good, and that gives us the right to use our judgment as best we can. There's nothing wrong with our making judgments based on the fact that we are good.
Yeah, okay, so that's...
We don't have to just accept the fact that we don't know anything. We have been judged as good, and we're qualified to make the best judgments we can. And I don't think God would overrule those judgments. Okay,
yeah, that's an excellent suggestion. I think it's it may encounter, though, the same problem that a second suggestion that I'm going to make now will encounter. Okay, so I think there are two roads you might go down here. One of them is the road you're suggesting, that we use our own human intuition, which has been authorized in a sense, recognized as on the whole reliable by none other than God himself, right? He's said we're good. I mean, sort of our natural inclinations and judgments are on the whole good, right? And so we can trust that, okay? And so if we have this inclination to relieve suffering, when we're virtuous people, then we should trust that. That's one road. Another road, which it might lead you to the same place, is one that's suggested by the philosopher Ira Schnall in a paper called Skeptical Theism and Moral Skepticism. It's right here. I think you can see that now. What he suggests is that there is a solution to be found in Revelation. I mean, he argues that it's a uniquely Jewish solution. I'm in agreement with David Schatz in an extremely important paper that forms the basis for much of the rest of the talk, called Should Theists Eschew Theodicies? I'm in agreement with him in his reply to Schnall that it's not a particularly Jewish response, okay, but it's a response that builds on revelation. So God has, you might think, solved this problem for us by just revealing his will. He has revealed to us that this is what we should do, okay, that we should relieve suffering. He has told us, you should relieve suffering, you should heal the sick, okay, you should give charity to the poor. And all of those things are basically what justify our behavior, even though maybe absent that, we would be skeptical and we wouldn't really know whether we should intervene or not intervene. Okay, but God has told us to do so. Okay, so this is sort of the divine counterpart to the suggestion that you made, and he points to this passage in the Talmud in Baba Kama, Pei Amud Aleph, right? That the Talmud says, "V'rapo yirapeh," on that verse that you shall surely heal. Mikan shenitan reshut l'rofei l'rapot. Okay, that this gives license to the physician. Permission is granted, to a doctor to heal. Okay, now why would we think it's not granted? The Talmud doesn't tell us why we would think that there's anything prohibited about this. But Rashi does tell us. Rashi says, skip to 7, we don't say God made him sick and they're going to heal, right? That is the Havamina, what we would have thought, but for this drasha, is that, look, God is the one who is responsible, or at least permitted this kind of suffering, this evil. So who are we to interfere? Who are we to contravene that that will of God? And so comes along the Torah as interpreted by the rabbis and it tells us, no, okay, I am authorizing you, not only authorizing, I'm mandating that you go ahead and offer that healing. Okay, I skipped over what Nachmanides says because actually Nachmanides, in a very striking and in some ways troubling passage in his commentary on the Torah, actually suggests that really there is no license for the sick person to go and seek out healing from the physician. It's only that once he comes to the physician is permitted to do so, to heal. And effectively, Nachmanides is actually following out the reasoning, I think, that we had, or that Rashi said was the Havamina, and that we're suggesting is really a deep skeptical problem, right? I mean, maybe God wants this to be the case, and therefore, if you have a problem, you should just go to God, okay, and let him decide whether to alleviate it. But that's certainly not the mainstream view. The mainstream view is you also are permitted to go and get medical treatment from a physician. It's not just a physician who's permitted to administer it. Okay, and so this Schnall suggests solves the problem. It addresses the issue because now we have a specific and clear mandate. But the problem is, I don't know what everyone here thinks about these solutions, right? The one that sort of, starts from our goodness and the correctness of our evaluations, or one that just, appeals to God's explicit commands. You're welcome to jump in and weigh in and tell me what you think. But I think the problem is highlighted by a number of other philosophers, and Hudson being one of them, who highlights it very nicely. He has an article in which he argues this, a pretty, a philosophical article. But he also has a beautiful book, highly recommended. It's a highly Christian book, and it includes some really deep reflections on the problem of evil in general and on this specific issue called Grotesque in the Garden. And what he argues is that there's still really no way to contain this skepticism. Once you grant that maybe there are all of these purposes that God has that justifies God in doing things that would otherwise be immoral, right? That would otherwise be completely problematic by the standards, that God himself has said he answers to, but are not problematic because of these dispensations, because of these great goods that we can't even imagine, then the problem of divine deception arises. The problem that, it's not like an absolute prohibition to lie to somebody. Kant thought there was an absolute prohibition to lie to somebody. But most sane people think that if the Nazi knocks on your door and asks, are you hiding any Jews? It's not obligatory for the person to tell the truth if he is hiding Jews, right? There's no absolute prohibition on lying, on most, plausible moral views. It depends on what justifications there are. Well, now, if there are all these possible justifications out there that are beyond our ken, we can't even fathom them, then it leads us, maybe it should lead us to think, how do we know? How can we be justified in believing X, Y, Z just because God told me X, Y, Z? The doubt here is not whether God is good, okay, or all powerful, or whatever other part of the traditional picture. It's even given that traditional picture, even given that God is wholly good and morally perfect, maybe God needs to deceive me for some good that I can't even fathom. Okay, and maybe God commands me to do something, not because that's really his will, right, that I do it, not because it's okay to do, but because he has some other purposes, again, maybe unfathomable beyond my ken, for issuing that command. Right? I mean, God could have all sorts of reasons for doing all sorts of things, not just for permitting the evils we're familiar with, but also for doing the things that we don't ordinarily think of as evil. Right? We don't think of them as evil at all. Like, God tells us something, we don't ordinarily think that's a case of evil, but maybe it is a case of a small little evil, right? God misleading us into thinking X, Y, Z when it's not really the case, but it's done for some good that we can't possibly understand. Okay, and so Hudson is not making this point as a response to Schnall in his reply, but I think you could use it to reply to Schnall, and also to the suggestion that God has told us that we're good. Okay, and therefore we can trust our judgment. Maybe God told us that we're good because he knows we need that, but it's really not true. I mean, there could be, that's just a suggestion that is within our ken, but maybe there are lots of things. Once we open this Pandora's box and say, the goods we know of are not representative at all of the possible goods there are, and there could be all these goods out there that would justify things that otherwise seem evil, then you can't really close that Pandora's box. And I don't see any neat solution, any easy way to just say, okay, well, God has basically told us the answers, okay? Because even those could, in some sense, be part of the problem. Okay, we might have to be skeptical about those if we endorse skeptical theism. So this leads me to the second prong, and I'm aware that we only have 11 minutes left, so I will do my best to cover what we can cover in the remaining 11 minutes. Again, whatever we can't cover, I strongly suggest you read David Schatz's article, Should Theodicies, because even if we could cover everything that's on the source sheet, there's much more there. At any rate, this maybe suggests a more radical sort of skepticism, a more radical rejection of the entire project of theodicy that we embarked on in the second and third lecture. Okay, and that's to basically just take what we call a quietistic approach. Okay, it's not one that has us examining the problem very carefully the way that we've done, and then offering this fancy skeptical theist response to parry the issue. It's just one that refuses to engage the problem in the first place. Right? It just says this problem is out of bounds. Okay, it's just not for us. It's just beyond us. It's not for us to deal with. Okay, and this is the impression you get from a number of traditional sources, very, very famous sources. Here's one very famous source, the Maran Nachot 29b, where after Moses learns of the existence of Rabbi Akiva, who's to come many generations later, and how great this man was, he says, can I see his reward? You've shown me his Torah, now show me his reward. And he then sees how Rabbi Akiva is martyred. Okay, he sees the consequences of Rabbi Akiva being martyred and tortured to death by the Romans. And Moshe says to God, Master of the universe, this is the Torah, and this is its reward. And very famously, God says, Shtok, kach alav machshava lefanai. Be silent, right? Or shut up. Okay, that's a very naturally read as a quietistic approach. It's not a sophisticated skeptical theism. It's just stop talking about this. Okay, this is not for you to discuss. Okay, and this has become a very, I'd say, maybe widespread approach in certain circles. Certainly in the second half of the 20th century, in light of the Holocaust, it took on, it maybe became the dominant approach in a way among a number of thinkers. And very famously, Rabbi Soloveitchik took this approach, much some say inconsistently, because other places he does seem to suggest some theodicies, as we ourselves have seen. But in his work Fate and Destiny, he famously, suggests that we don't look for the why, like we look at what is our practical response, what is the proper response to evil. We don't ask why did the evil occur. Here is a passage from his Out of the Whirlwind, a collection of essays on Job. He says, yes, the top of halakha has evolved an ethic of suffering instead of a metaphysic of suffering, his way of talking about the whys, the theodicies, you might suggest. While the metaphysic is out to discover the ontological objective reason of suffering from within, the ethic posits meanings from within and without. Okay, and skip a few lines. This is the difference between a metaphysic and an ethic of evil. The metaphysic seeks to justify evil or deny its reality. The ethic of suffering seeks the transformation of an alien factum which one encounters into an actus in which one engages. Okay, and so the idea is, yes, we deal with evil, we contend with evil, we don't ignore evil, but we don't give it a theoretical response. We don't even give it a theoretical hearing. Okay, on this view. Now, I think the prima facie problem, at least for a philosopher looking at this, is that I think if you say this, right, you face a trilemma, okay, three possibilities. And as a quietist, you might say, well, I don't have to endorse any of these. I don't have to take a position even on any of these three things. But it's still a fact that there are these three options, and so they exhaust all the possibilities. They exhaust logical space. Okay, and that even if you don't take a position on the question, it could still create problems for your position. So one, it could be that there is a justification for these things, and justifications that are within our ken. We could, if we tried hard enough, discover what some of these justifications are. That's one possibility. A second possibility is there is justification or justifications, but they're not within our ken. We couldn't discover them. And the third is just that there's no justification at all. Okay, God allows these things, and as a matter of fact, there isn't a justification. Now, we might not know which of these is right, but to think about it this way, okay, the second possibility just suffers from the same problems as skeptical theism that we just noted, the ones that say that there is a justification, but it's just beyond our ken. Okay, that generates the problems that we just discussed, and it leads to this moral skepticism. And the third possibility that says that there's just no justification at all seems just to concede the truth of atheism, right? It doesn't seem like it leaves any room out, okay, any wiggle room. So we're just left with the first possibility that no, there are justifications, and they are within our ken. And nonetheless, we say shtok, okay, don't pursue these. But then the question is, why not, right? I mean, if there are these justifications and they're out there and we could discover them and understand them, why would it be prudent, why would it be rational or religiously virtuous to avoid investigating them? So there are a number of suggestions one can make here, okay, to explain that. Why would you avoid investigating this if you could actually turn up some of the possible justifications that God might have? We're only going to look at one, okay? And that's the explanation that doing so, engaging in this endeavor of theodicy, or even having a theodicy, leads or ought to lead to moral complacency. Okay, this is a theme that you see elsewhere in Rabbi Soloveitchik, at least with regard to the sort of attempt to flee this world and think about another world. It's even more explicit in some of Rabbi Jonathan Sachs's writings. He says, as a piece of homiletics, this is quite beautiful. Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. Why was he afraid? Because if he were to fully to understand God, he would have no choice but to be reconciled to the slavery and oppression of the world. From the vantage point of eternity, he would see that the bad is a necessary stage on the journey to the good. That is, he would have the correct theodicy. He would understand God, and he would cease to be Moses, the fighter against injustice, to intervene whenever he saw wrong being done. He was afraid. What was he afraid of? That seeing heaven would desensitize him to earth. That coming close to infinity would mean losing his humanity. Okay, now that's extremely eloquent and beautiful, but we have to ask if it withstands critical scrutiny. Okay, and I'm not really sure it does. And here I think there are a number of important distinctions that we should keep in mind that might be relevant here. So one is a distinction that we briefly mentioned between two kinds of problems of evil. Okay, two sorts of data points that serve as the basis for the problem of evil. Okay, there is what's called the global problem of evil, right? Of how it could be, given God's existence, that there is evil and that there is evil in this magnitude and distributed in this sort of way. That's the global problem of evil. And then there's something called the local problem of evil. You might ask about a particular evil thing, a particular bad occurrence, and ask, well, how could this have happened? How could this have been allowed if God is what we think he is? Okay, now it seems to me that if we're talking specifically about the global problem of evil, okay, rather than the local problem of evil, then the problem that Rabbi Sachs and Rabbi Soloveitchik are pointing to doesn't really get off the ground, right? I mean, to appreciate how this might go, here's a view out there. A philosopher by the name of Peter Van Imwagen suggests that the solution to the global problem of evil involves, at least in part, some commitment to there being chance. Okay, that God leaves certain things up to chance. Okay, and there's a whole story that he has to tell why he would do that. But then if that's your answer, or part of your answer to the global problem of evil, then your answer to the local problem of evil won't be an answer. I mean, it won't be a justification for that particular evil. If someone asks, well, why did this particular event happen? The answer could very well be no reason at all. Right? There's just no explanation for that. Okay, but that's consistent with God being who we take God to be, because God relied on this sort of chancy element. Okay, so if you see how the sort of the dynamic between these two problems, then the problem that the difficulty that Rabbi Sachs and Rabbi Soloveitchik are suggesting, I mean, that doesn't really even begin, right? There's no reason at all to think that I shouldn't alleviate this kind of suffering that I see, just because I have an explanation for why there is evil, period. I mean, me knowing or thinking I know why there might be evil doesn't get me off the hook for addressing this particular evil if the answer I have doesn't address why there is this particular evil. But in any case, I mean, I think the idea is just plain wrong, and it actually gets things backwards, right? I think it's specifically the skepticism that we talked about in the form of skeptical theism that creates the problem. If you have no idea why God allows this, you think, okay, God has his reasons, and I don't know what they are, then I really do think I'm sort of paralyzed morally as to whether I should alleviate the suffering I see and prevent the evil that I see. But if I have a particular theodicy, then depending on the character of the theodicy, depending on what the theodicy is, I might have a very good reason to alleviate this suffering. Okay, as others have pointed out, if I think that the correct theodicy, for example, is the soul-making theodicy that we discussed, the whole purpose of evil is to elicit the response on the part of the others, then to the contrary, right, against what Rabbi Sachs and Rabbi Soloveitchik are suggesting, my having that theodicy is no reason at all for me to refrain from alleviating suffering. If anything, it's a reason for me to engage in the alleviation of suffering. So I think, to be honest, the bottom line, and there's much more to say here, but we're already out of time, we've gone a minute over. The bottom line regarding this more radical quietism seems to be there's no good objection, I think, to the project of engaging in theodicy that doesn't itself collapse into an even more problematic view. Okay, so where are we left with at the end of these 4 lectures and at the end of a much longer examination, if we could? I think the words of Nachmanides here are wise. Okay, I mean, on the one hand, and I'm not going to read them inside because we're again out of time, but you're welcome to. He explicitly counters this anti-theodicy approach and suggests there are actually positive benefits to engaging in theodicy. And I'm not sure he's right about what those positive benefits, but it seems to me that his point on the whole is correct, that it's really the only responsible, intellectually responsible approach. If you are in fact already bothered by the question, there's no choice, it's responsible, but to pursue these things, right? And what we do is we keep on searching, while recognizing our epistemic and intellectual limits, and we try to just get a glimpse, okay, of God's ways and to make sense as best as we can of what strikes us as a badly, morally incoherent world, and hopefully in doing so get at least some insight, as limited as it is, into our place in the universe and into our relationship with God. Okay, so that's the end. And thank you very much for all your participation throughout. I very much enjoyed it and got a lot from it.
Should we take some questions first? Oh, there you go. Susan, would you like to go? Go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much. I enjoyed the whole series. I was missing for one, but I heard it on the replay one day. And this last lecture reminds me a lot of, and I don't know if you're familiar with the Threepenny Opera and Bertolt Brecht, but Mac the Knife, Mac is a fairly evil character, and then out of the blue at the end of it, God forgives Mac, and Mac avoids the death penalty. And we can't understand, and that's the situation that we have. But it doesn't stop us from. I agree. It doesn't stop us from asking the questions, just because we may or may not be qualified. But I really enjoyed the whole process here.
Okay, thanks so much. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Segal, for this final class in this session and for the whole session. And thank you everyone who joined us today here on Zoom, on Drisha Live, and also those who watched us live on Facebook. We continue our spring program this evening at 8 p.m. with the second class in this series, What Stops the Plague, with Miriam Gedweiser. In addition, we have many more classes happening right now. You can find out more information at www.drisha.org/classes. So thank you again for the opportunity to learn with you, Dr. Segal. I hope you have a good night and good afternoon to those who are here in the US. And thanks everyone. I hope to see you soon at one of our upcoming classes at Drisha.
Thank you so much, everyone.